The dark side of the Force casts a shadow over the galaxy. Separatist rebellions have won many key victories against the Republic and forced them to abandon vast swathes of territory. The Supreme Leader Snoke and his First Order militia continue working to establish a unified opposition to the Republic. Meanwhile, Force-sensitive sages have prophesied an even greater threat to the galaxy, the resurgence of the Sith. Seeking to counter this threat, General Leia Organa has dispatched scouts to search for artifacts relating to the Force. Many believe that the last hope of the Republic lies with the lost secrets of the Jedi Order. I've agonized for a while about how much preamble to include here, mostly because it's been very hard for me not to start this video off with a few comments on The Last Jedi, which inevitably turn into a lot of comments, until this whole video turns into more of a review than a rewrite. See, The Last Jedi is a bad movie. That's why I'm fixing it. The Last Jedi is bad in almost every single way. It has problems with plot structure and pacing, theme and tone, world building and logic, and then on top of all of that, there are some very specific decisions that were very controversial and quite poorly handled. However, I honestly don't have a very strong opinion about this film. As far as I'm concerned, Disney's entire trilogy was dead on arrival. The Force Awakens essentially said, hey, remember the original trilogy? Well, screw it. It was pointless. Here comes the First Order and they're just blowing up the entire Republic. Were you worried that the First Order are just a clone of the Empire? Well, don't worry, they're actually way more powerful. They have this space weapon that makes the Death Star look like nothing by comparison. The galaxy is in a darker place in Episode 7 than it was in Episodes 4, 5, or 6. Nice going, Han, Luke, and Leia. Thanks for nothing. The original trilogy was really just filler until the real heroes could come along and save the galaxy. So yeah, I'm not one of those people who thinks that Rian Johnson ruined Star Wars. It was already ruined. Do whatever you want, Ryan. Start your opening crawl by reminding us that the First Order is the ruling power. Reduce the resistance to a small crew on one ship. Rub that salt in the wound, because it's not my wound. I have no investment in this trilogy, and I don't consider it Star Wars. Never mind Jake Skywalker, this whole trilogy is Jake Wars, about the Jake Rebellion in the Jake Galaxy. If we're going to rewrite Episode 8, we need to start with a better Episode 7. We need an Episode 7 that makes us want to see how the saga will end, rather than disengaging with Disney's whole trilogy because it's just one massive middle finger to the entire saga so far. The good news is, I've already rewritten Episode 7. I would highly recommend you check it out, because this video will be following on from that. However, in short, I'll just say that it's a rewrite where the First Order isn't as powerful as the Empire, it doesn't feature a ridiculous doomsday weapon, and the victories of the original trilogy actually matter. So you definitely should check that out, but otherwise enjoy trying to pick up the changes as we go along. Also, a lot of people liked my Episode 7 rewrite but then didn't subscribe, meaning they might not actually end up ever seeing this video. So if you do like one of my videos, I'd recommend that you subscribe because the chances are that you'll like my other videos too. On that note, by the way, my Jurassic World reviews are gone now because Universal continued their fraudulent copyright claims, and I don't think I have a big enough audience to fight them at this point. So back to that opening crawl. We start with a scouting party on a planet. The specific planet literally doesn't matter, so insert whatever expanded universe cameo you like here. The film basically starts with an excavation of an old Jedi complex. We see them discovering and filing significant amounts of archived information. After a short while, a wall breaks down, and we see the excavators react in astonishment to something. They immediately signal to contact Leia as soon as possible because they've found something big. We still don't see what they found, but we hear the distinctive beeping of R2-D2. Meanwhile, we cut to Finn and Rey playing around on a Republic starship. Rey is trying to practice blocking blaster bolts while blinded with a blast helmet, but Finn is reluctant to shoot at her in case she fails to block it and, gets shot. So they're basically playing a game of chicken where Rey is like, come on, do it, shoot me, and Finn is getting geared up to do it, but then chickening out at the last minute. And then he actually does try to do it, and Rey is like, wait, don't, I'm not ready, and so on. It's basically just a light-hearted scene to establish that these two characters have become quite friendly in the year or so since the previous film. In the midst of all this, Poe walks in to explain that they're heading to a nearby planet to retrieve R2-D2. He adds that R2 might be the key to finding Luke Skywalker, and in a teasing way points out that Rey could probably use a teacher who might take things a bit more seriously. Rey takes off her blast helmet and says, "I think our training's going fine." Poe tests this statement by shooting at Rey, who fails to block the shot and gets hit in the arm. Rey and Finn both look at Poe with horrified expressions, at which point Poe is like, "It's on practice mode?" And then Finn and Rey are like, "Oh, there's a practice mode?" I'm really happy with this scene. I think it's light-hearted at an appropriate point for the story, without taking away stakes from an otherwise serious situation. This is just a bunch of characters goofing around and being a little bit silly because they're friends. This isn't the Disney version where at the beginning of episode 8, the main characters have only known each other for a few days at best, or else literally not at all in the case of Rey and Poe. This scene introduces our characters, re-establishes their relationships, while also introducing Rey's need for training as a major plot point for the film, and all of this alongside establishing the first major plot beat, retrieving R2-D2. We return to the scene of the excavation, where a handful of nameless characters are engaging in small talk. One of them is like, "Hey, you think this Luke Skywalker guy is the real deal?" Another one is like, "Yeah, the guy killed his own dad, he doesn't mess around." Third one says, "He didn't kill his dad, you idiot, he saved his dad." Another one is like, "Well, that's what people say, but then why did he disappear? He must have a guilty conscience about something." I feel like we really need a scene like this in the sequel trilogy to show that Luke is this larger-than-life figure in a lot of people's minds, and people have all sorts of different opinions about him. People think of him as an uncompromising slayer of evil, a righteous and merciful hero, or a morally compromised religious zealot. It helps to paint a picture of what it would be like for the average person to conceive of the exploits of the Jedi from an outsider's perspective. Anyway, to conclude this lively discussion, somebody chimes in, or maybe he's been working on some super secret force technique where he can just think about killing you and boom, you're dead. Suddenly this guy gets shot as the excavation site immediately explodes into a frenzy of intense conflict. We see that Captain Phasma is leading an assault on the site to intercept the data, and her force quite proficiently takes out the Republic soldiers. She makes a call to General Hux and tells him that she has secured vital intel and needs extraction immediately. She looks around and remarks on how there are other Republic soldiers who would likely outnumber her men if they launched a counter-assault. Hux instructs her to remain in her position and defend the droid. Phasma says that she's not suicidal and will retreat if extraction is not quick enough, but Hux says disobeying orders would make her an enemy of the Supreme Leader. The Republic ship, the Radus, the same ship from the Disney film, arrives on the planet, and Leia explains that their top priority needs to be securing the vital intel. Admiral Holdo lays out a rough battle strategy that involves Rey and a few other pilots, including Rose Tico's sister, who is apparently called Paige, bombarding the First Order from above, while a ground force, including Poe and Finn, enter the complex. At this, Poe walks up to Holdo and says, "Hey, I usually fly, I'm a pilot, I'm pretty good." Holdo responds, "Hey, I usually command, I'm an admiral, I'm pretty good, and I'm telling you that we have a lot of pilots on this ship and relatively few ground troops." Poe bristles at this, but ultimately joins the ground troops in landing on the planet. We open the action with another slightly comedic scene where Finn and Poe see a group of First Order troopers and charge in, shooting all of them. However, the troopers seem entirely unaffected, and Finn and Poe look at each other and are like, guns are still on practice mode. They then run away from the troopers, who are now in a position to shoot at them. Basically view this scene as similar to Han Solo running into a massive group of stormtroopers in A New Hope. The two end up being chased into the wreckage of an old starship that had crashed nearby, presumably from some previous battle. The way I imagine it is that the shipwreck landed basically on top of this ancient Jedi complex, such that the two are functionally merged. Hux finally arrives and sends out fighters to take on the Republic fleet. There is a substantial dogfight between the Republic and the First Order, where Rey's weapons end up getting damaged. Meanwhile, Finn and Poe are still running from the stormtroopers through the starship wreckage, and they make a call for a fighter to shoot at the hallway behind them to stop the stormtroopers catching up. Rey is the closest to their location, but her guns still aren't working, so she tries to clip the roof of the ship with her wings, causing the hallway to collapse on the troopers. However, her ship ends up damaged such that she's forced to ground the fighter. At this point, a storm begins to pick up on the planet, so Finn runs to help Rey and bring her inside as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Poe spots Captain Phasma running away, having abandoned her post. Poe begins to chase after her, and Holdo contacts Poe to say that the objective of the mission is to facilitate the collection of intel as quickly as possible, so that they can fly away before they take too much damage from Hux's ship. We see on Hux's ship that they are beginning to charge up a cannon that could deal considerable damage. However, Poe argues with Holdo that Captain Phasma would be a valuable captive, and he ultimately ignores her direct orders. Rey and Finn get notified that Hux's ship is charging its cannons to deal massive damage. However, the wrecked ship they're on has more powerful cannons, so if they can reach the emergency power generators, they might be able to return fire and keep Hux's ship away. Finn and Rey head to the emergency power generator, however the ship has been cracked in two, such that there are several enemy soldiers on the other side of the room, separated by a crack in the floor, but able to shoot at Finn and Rey if they try to get to the switch. Finn suggests that Rey needs to use her lightsaber to block the blaster bolts from the troopers. However, Rey points out that she was entirely unable to do this when Poe shot at her because she could see. All of this leads to a scene of Rey sidestepping across the room with a crate on her head, blocking blaster bolts while Finn crouches behind her for cover. I like to imagine that the crate wouldn't even fit over Rey's head particularly well, so it would be knocked about as she's blocking the shots. Ultimately, Finn flips the switch and the Republic forces are able to use the cannons to fire at Hux's ship and force it away from the planet. Hux responds by deciding to send out even more fighters to do as much damage as they can at closer range. I'm not sure quite why I felt like this opening act needed so many comedic scenes. I think the main reason is that I'm planning on having this film build up to an incredibly downer ending, so I think the contrast works particularly well. This shows that things still aren't incredibly serious for the Republic, but we'll see throughout this film how things get worse for them. Anyway, so with this dogfight going on, Rey realizes that she has to head back up in a ship. Finn tells her to take R2-D2 since she is force sensitive and should therefore be able to protect him. Rey flies up and engages in some dogfighting, but suddenly she loses control of the ship and whizzes off away from the battle. Also, throughout all of this, we do intercut with Poe chasing Phasma, and at this point Leia points out that they do need more fighters now, and that if Poe had stuck with the plan and stayed put instead of pursuing Phasma, he could be part of a relief force of fighters, since the situation on the ground has turned in the Republic's favor. Holdo explains that they need to evacuate as soon as possible to avoid taking any damage. However, at this point Poe has lost Phasma and is on the wrong side of the ship wreckage, very far away. Fortunately though, he explains that he has a plan. Leia is of course like, oh god, not any more plans please. Poe's plan is to head to an escape pod where he can be ejected from the wrecked ship with some speed. Of course, he wouldn't be at escape velocity, so while he was in the air, he would just need one of the Republic fighters to use a tow cable to grab the escape pod and pull it up towards the Radius. At this point, all of the Republic troops have either been evacuated in troop transports or assigned to fighters, so Finn is now in a fighter and says that he can rescue Poe. So Poe ejects from the ship in the escape pod and is fired quite a distance up into the air. Finn deploys his tow cable and misses Poe. Poe achieves peak altitude and starts to fall back down to the planet until suddenly another fighter comes along and attaches their tow cable. It's Paige Tico. Paige is dragging Poe up towards the starship when suddenly some fighters start pursuing them. Paige decides to turn around in a way that basically slings Poe towards the Radius where he can land and be safe while she deals with the fighters. However, Paige ultimately gets shot down and dies. With all these surviving Republic troops now on the Radius, they head into hyperspace and disappear. Okay, so let's talk about this scene, the scene from the Disney version, and Poe's character arc. It's very obvious what the Disney version is trying to do. It's trying to deconstruct Poe's character as the trope of somebody who doesn't go by the book. In action-adventure films, we often have the character who says, screw standard procedure, screw the chain of command, I'm doing my own thing for myself. And consistently, this character is shown as being a hero for doing this. And it's pretty clear that the Disney version is asking, well, what if sometimes the chain of command exists for a reason? What if actually, consistently being the maverick flyboy can be bad for the overall objectives of the mission? What if Poe deserves to be humbled and realize he can't just always be led by his gut and his ego in opposition to what he's supposed to be doing as a member of a team? The issue is that the Disney film, in my opinion, does a really bad job at asking this question. Because let's look at how Poe is presented in the opening of the Disney film. He starts off being cocky, but in a way that the audience is clearly supposed to find funny and likable, rather than cocksure and arrogant. He then shows incredible proficiency, clearing out all of the surface cannons, specifically with the goal of ensuring that bombers will be fine to make a pass. After this, he simply tells the bombers to advance, and the attack commences. Now, what you'll notice is that there is very little in the actual actions of Poe here to indicate that he did anything wrong. The only suggestion we get that he has done something wrong comes in the form of the direct condemnation from his superiors. Leia tells him not to do it, and then demotes him afterwards. But actually, if it weren't for these reactions from Leia, I think most viewers would interpret this as a major victory for the rebellion. This goes against the basic movie-making principle of show, don't tell. We're told that Poe's actions here were inappropriate and reckless, but what we're shown totally contradicts that. This ship has the ability to wipe out the rebellion once and for all. This is clearly shown to be a major engagement where it would be worth taking a big risk. The dreadnought is big and imposing, and the destruction of it seems like it would be an obvious tactical victory. Indeed, just before the dreadnought is destroyed, we see it about to fire on the Republic ship, which makes the destruction of the dreadnought come across as a major victory, and it's treated triumphantly as such. This is why I think a lot of people responded negatively to being told that Poe's character arc is to be less arrogant and learn to obey authority, because the film is basically gaslighting us. Everything we are actually shown suggests that Poe made the right moves, but the film simply tells us that he's a cocksure flyboy who needs to be reined in. Also, it's not clear to me at all that Poe's actions represent poor strategy. It's implied that it was wasteful for them to have lost so many ships taking out this one dreadnought, but why was this a bad time to sacrifice these ships? Is the expectation that they should only fight when they're likely to take no losses? Because that seems unrealistic. Rather, it would seem that they should fight when they stand to inflict more damage on the First Order than they will sustain from whatever ships they lose. And it seems like taking out this ship is an example of that. Sure, if Poe had disengaged right away, then the Republic would have had more ships to fight another day, but so would the First Order. And this is especially significant when considering that the Republic end up getting tracked through hyperspace, meaning that this dreadnought would have been able to follow them. Their whole plan at the end of the film is to hide in this base on Crate, and you're just left thinking, man, it sure is a good thing that Poe took out that ship that could blow up an entire base earlier. But no, we're supposed to understand that Poe's actions were reckless and warranted him being demoted, because we're told these things, even though everything we're shown suggests Poe is a very capable commander who took the initiative and saved the Republic. Also, the part of this battle that did go badly, so many of the bombers being destroyed, wasn't even Poe's fault. Most of them get taken out by the First Order by mistake because of how close they are to each other. Also, I like how their bombers fly close enough to the dreadnought that the explosion of their own bombs can kill them. The point is that most of the deaths in this battle come from the stupid decision to have dense formations flying very close to the ship rather than from Poe's decision to disobey Leia's command to disengage. So I thought it would be fun to take Rian Johnson's goal of showing Poe as a flawed protagonist who needs to learn a lesson and actually, do it properly. So let's just point out how Poe's actions in my version achieve this. First of all, Poe immediately questions Holdo's command by saying that he's a pilot, and has to be reminded that while he may be a good pilot, the mission in the early stages needs more ground troops than pilots. This immediately shows a tendency to put his own ego above what's best for the mission. Then the big decision Poe makes is to chase after Captain Phasma. Securing the intel is what would be best for the mission, but it isn't a glamorous victory. Capturing or killing Phasma would be a huge personal victory, but clearly wouldn't be a major victory for the Republic's war efforts, even if he did succeed. We then clearly see how Poe has made the wrong call by not even being able to catch Phasma, and finding himself too far away from the rest of the troops to actually help much with the rest of the battle. Instead, he is forced to hatch an elaborate plan to get off the planet to compensate for this error. And Poe's plan to use the ejection of an escape pod to propel himself into the air and be caught by another ship is a really cool plan. It's the kind of novel, unconventional thinking you'd expect from a maverick who doesn't do things by the book, and it leads to the needless death of an innocent person who gave their life to rescue Poe after Poe abandoned the mission assigned to him to chase his own personal glory. I think that if people saw these actions from Poe, they'd understand that this is a character who has some flaws that need to be addressed by going through an arc where he learns to find a balance between taking the initiative for himself and obeying orders to do what's best for the mission, rather than in the Disney film where most people were confused and annoyed at why Poe was being treated like an arrogant jerk when he really hadn't done anything wrong. Okay, so back to the film, where we see Kylo getting chastised by Snoke. This would basically play out just like it did in the Disney film. He points out that Kylo shouldn't have struggled to defeat Rey in the previous film. You might say this makes less sense here, because in my version a year or so has passed since the last film, so Kylo's duel with Rey was a while ago. But honestly, I think this actually works even better. It implies that Snoke has just been needling Kylo about his weaknesses for the past year, and adds more to the abusive nature of their relationship. I'm also fine with the reveal that Snoke doesn't even like Kylo's mask and thinks that it's stupid. There's really only one change I would make to this scene. I wouldn't have Snoke use the Force. In my version of these films, Snoke is not Force sensitive. I think it would just make him a more interesting villain if he's a regular guy who has the ability to manipulate people, a bit more like an actual military leader. His dynamic with Kylo is therefore that Kylo is more physically powerful than Snoke. Snoke has basically no physical power at all, but Snoke has manipulated Kylo into his Force-sensitive henchman, so Snoke is basically wielding Kylo's power by proxy rather than having any real physical power of his own. Back on the Radis, Holdo is processing some of the intel that they secured from the planet when Poe eventually emerges after being treated for some injuries he sustained upon entering the ship. Holdo, of course, goes in pretty damn hard against Poe. She explains essentially all of the objections that she had to him in the Disney version, except unlike in the Disney version, it actually makes sense for her to have these objections. Leia also jumps in to tell Poe that he's been demoted due to his actions, and Poe starts to get defensive. However, before the argument can progress much, they are interrupted by suddenly dropping out of hyperspace. There's a brief confusion in which all we find out is that the hyperdrive is broken in some way. In the middle of this distress, Finn suddenly realizes that Rey isn't around and starts asking where Rey is. Holdo similarly then suddenly realizes that R2-D2 is absent as well. And next we cut to Rey landing on the idyllic island planet where she finds Luke in the Disney film. R2-D2 took control of the ship to fly back to his master. Rey doesn't quite realize what has happened until she stumbles upon Luke living his reclusive life. So I guess it's time for another break to talk about Luke's characterization. Something I should point out is that for me, these rewrites are an exercise in creative thinking, and something that makes any intellectual exercise worthwhile is constraints. So a self-imposed constraint with these videos has been to use the Disney versions as blueprints. I could have just gone into these rewrites with no constraints at all, and just told a story completely made up by me. But that wouldn't have been interesting. What's interesting is taking the Disney films as they are and seeing what changes I can make to ensure they work a little bit better. However, with The Last Jedi, this means that I have to consider and break down every controversial decision made in the Disney version and think about whether I can make it work. We've already done this once with the way that the Disney film handled Poe, but now we have to talk about Luke Skywalker's characterization, which was very controversial. As I see it, Luke's disposition in Episode 8 can be broken down into two aspects: his ideological objection to the Jedi and his personal and emotional baggage. Now, it seems to me that a lot of people think that Luke's ideological rejection of the Jedi is one of the few things they really like about this film, and I have to say that I absolutely disagree with that. Firstly, in principle, it seems weird to have the last time we see Luke be in Return of the Jedi, where his father returning from being a Sith to become the Jedi he once was is treated as the titular triumph of the film, only to then suddenly be expected to buy this idea that actually the Jedi need to die. Especially seeing as Luke is apparently not even that committed to this idea. It doesn't take much for him to be triumphantly declaring at the end of the film that the Jedi will continue. So what's the deal, Luke? Is the Jedi actually bad or not? Honestly though, it's not surprising that Luke's ideological rejection of the Jedi is utterly inscrutable, because the Jedi really aren't that interesting as an ideological organization. Based on the film series, the main thing we know about them is that they're the good guys. The Star Wars universe really is quite morally binary, and trying to force in some moral nuance by saying that actually maybe the Jedi are bad just comes across as really desperate and unconvincing to me. The only thing I could reasonably imagine somebody objecting to with the Jedi is the celibacy requirement, but is being horny really where we want to anchor our moral nuance for this film? The only other bad aspect of the Jedi is taking young kids from their family, but this was something Luke didn't even experience. Luke was a Jedi, and he was trained as an adult, so clearly training children isn't essential to being a Jedi. There aren't really any rational ideological reasons to want the Jedi to end, and the explicit reasons we're given for why the Jedi needs to end are sort of nonsense. Firstly, we're told that the Force does not belong to the Jedi, which is true, but why does that mean the Jedi can't exist? It's never previously been established that the Jedi don't let other people use the Force. The second reason, however, is even dumber, that the Jedi allowed Darth Sidious to rise. This is like if somebody said that liberal democracy needs to be destroyed because of appeasement in the 1930s. Just because a group might not be perfect at preventing any possible opposition, it doesn't therefore follow that this group shouldn't exist. It just seems so painfully obvious that saying the Jedi didn't do enough to stop Darth Sidious does not lend itself to the conclusion that there shouldn't be any Jedi at all. The funny thing is that I actually do think that the sequel trilogy should try to engender a rethinking of the Force in the series, but I just don't think that expressing this rethinking as an opposition to the existence of the Jedi works when the Jedi are so transparently good. Now, the other aspect of Luke's character is the more personal, emotional stuff, which seems to be specifically about his guilt over what happened with Kylo, and then his overall sense of self-doubt. So what is my plan? Well, I'm personally fine with Luke being a different character 30 years after we last saw him. However, I honestly think that this rejection of the Jedi stuff just distracts from the emotional aspect, which I think is much stronger. And for me, I believe his emotional baggage should comprise 4 core struggles. The first would be the basic struggle that people have adjusting to normal life after a war. Luke was involved in this incredibly major conflict when he was very young, and it isn't hard to imagine that this would present mental obstacles for him going forward. The second emotional issue for Luke would simply be the sense of pressure at having been the savior of the galaxy. This is something we see in the Disney film, where Luke talks about how the idea of Luke Skywalker is something beyond who he really is as a person. The third issue would be his fear about the dark side, both his fear of the dark side returning, and also his fear of being tempted by the dark side himself. And finally, of course, it would make sense that he did train Kylo, and thus would have a feeling of guilt about Kylo turning to the dark side. Now, apparently some people would have liked for Luke to be this super chirpy, incredibly happy and hopeful person in these films, including seemingly Mark Hamill himself. But that just seems boring to me. I want Luke to be a bit more dynamic, and that does require change in his character. I bring up how I would characterize Luke right out the gate because I tend to avoid pitching explicit dialogue. So therefore, for much of our introduction to Luke, you're just going to have to imagine what kind of dialogue might communicate the characterization I've laid out here. So in Rey and Luke's first meeting, she tells him that he needs to return, like she does in the actual film, and he makes the same dismissive remarks about how he's not some magical hero who will be able to save the day with his infallible messianic presence. He's just a flawed human being who's already done more than could fairly be asked of him to help the galaxy, and now he just wants to live in peace. Back on the Raddus, we get a more detailed explanation of the issue with the hyperdrive. We find out that it's damaged in this bizarre way that none of the engineers can quite figure out, which is causing it to basically leak out hyperspace into regular space. So my understanding is that hyperspace isn't just traveling really fast, but rather hyperspace is a different plane of space where matter is contracted, thus allowing ships to travel larger distances very quickly. The purpose of the hyperdrive is to take ships into hyperspace. However, this hyperdrive is broken in such a way that the line between regular space and hyperspace is being blurred. Pretty simple problem, but hard to fix. Ultimately, they're in the same situation that they are in the Disney film, being slowly pursued while risking running out of fuel and unable to jump into hyperspace. Poe responds to all of this by really pushing to find out what the plan is, but Holdo says that he's been demoted and therefore isn't privy to that information. We then get the attack that happens in the Disney version where Kylo nearly shoots Leia, but then decides not to. I like that moment for his growth, and I also like the way that another fighter ends up shooting the bridge to give the impression to Leia that Kylo did shoot her. However, I would just have Leia be injured rather than the whole flying through space thing. I also wouldn't have Admiral Akbar be killed because it just seems weird to have such a classic character be killed as mere collateral damage in this Kylo Leia moment. Rey decides to explore the island and ends up finding the Jedi techs. She's taking a cursory look at the techs while Luke explores the Millennium Falcon. He encounters R2 and has basically the same conversation he has in the Disney film, ending with R2's dirty trick of playing the Leia hologram from A New Hope. I think this is some really clever reincorporation and a great way to motivate Luke's decision to train Rey. I should stress though that here the focus will just be that he'll train her, not that he'll train her about how the Jedi need to end, because I just think that whole aspect of the film can't be sufficiently developed. Poe walks in on Holdo processing some more of the intel, but she seems to hurriedly close a particular piece of information and acts suspicious about it. Poe recognizes this but doesn't confront her about what she's hiding. Rather, he instead repeats his concerns about them not having a plan and how they need to know now that they have one. Holdo again tells him that any plan would be classified information that he is not in a position to know, especially since she can't really trust him to obey the plan even if she did tell him it. Poe storms off feeling angry. Rey is again reading the Jedi text, but this time she suddenly sees Kylo. She shoots at him and blows a hole in the wall. It plays out similar to the Disney version, including being interrupted by Luke appearing to begin Rey's training about meditation. Rey begins to meditate and understand the Force. Meanwhile, Poe finds Finn and reveals his suspicions about Holdo, and that he's found out that she has been ordering weapons from Canto Bight. Poe explains that Canto Bight makes weapons for the First Order. He convinces Finn to help him try to break into the area where the data is stored to see if they can find something to incriminate Holdo. They get past the security and enter the area where the data is being stored, but they are quickly captured and detained in the ship's jail. Rey and Kylo again end up talking. Just like in the Disney version, the main focus would be Rey grilling Kylo about how abhorrent it was for him to kill Han. One small addition I would make is having Kylo voice his frustrations with Luke having not been proactive as a Jedi Master. This would further develop Luke's reasons for becoming a recluse, his exhaustion of being a Jedi after the events of the original trilogy, while also establishing the type of frustrations we could imagine might set Kylo up for joining the dark side. It also works quite well as an ironic twist. One of Luke's key reasons for being non-committal in his role as a Jedi Master was his fear of the dark side, but ironically it was this attitude that left his gifted students more easily tempted by the promise of greater things on the dark side. Anyway, after this conversation, Luke again trains Rey, still focusing on the mental aspect of the Force and how this allows for Jedis to manipulate reality with their mind. Rey ends up going to the dark side place and Luke refuses to train her anymore. However, Rey pushes back against Luke. She points out that he has cut himself off from the Force and that you can't defeat the dark side by cutting yourself off from the light. Rey challenges Luke to train her to be powerful, while also training her in avoiding the temptations of the dark side. She assures him it can be done, and Luke agrees. We then see Kylo and the rest of the First Order commanders discussing their basic plan for the film. Hux explains that he will lead an attack on the deep core planets of the Republic, while much of the High Command is being pinned down by the First Order. Meanwhile, Captain Phasma and Kylo will launch the assault against the Raddus to capture the Republic generals. It's also revealed that the First Order have infiltrated the Raddus with their own inside operative. Meanwhile, Poe and Finn are stuck in prison. To pass the time, they start telling stories of their first major experiences of combat. Poe starts off by telling the story of how they attacked a separatist transport carrying huge numbers of weapons to rebellious systems, and how he blew it up. He reflects on how this contrasts with how powerless he feels in his current situation. Finn responds by narrating his first major battle, where he and some friends were working with a group of gangsters, but the gangsters double-crossed them and killed his friend. Finn explains that he pledged his loyalty to the First Order shortly after that, in the hopes that he would be able to take revenge on the gangsters who double-crossed him. Poe asks if he succeeded in finding them and taking revenge, to which Finn answers the question indirectly by saying that it wasn't worth it. Suddenly a man appears, DJ, and tells them that he can get them out of prison. He says that he believes them about Holdo and could help them to get to Canto Bight to investigate. They stealthily make their way off the Raddus in a stolen ship. However, just as Poe is walking around the ship, talking about the plan to head to Canto Bight, he comes face to face with Rose, pointing a blaster at him. Rose says that she's going to shoot him unless he turns the ship round and returns to the Raddus. Poe tries to convince her that they need to escape, but Rose doesn't want to hear anything Poe says, as she blames him for the death of her sister. Just as Poe is realizing he won't be able to talk his way out of this, Finn walks into the room. Rose sees Finn and immediately starts fangirling over him. She mentions how she heard about how he left the First Order despite the huge risks. She tells him he's a hero. Finn is able to leverage this enthusiasm from Rose to vouch for Poe and explain that Paige's death was just a mistake. He also, of course, mentions that Poe was a major part of why Finn left the First Order in the first place, so Rose cautiously agrees to their plan of heading to Canto Bight. We then return to Rey finally learning to train with a lightsaber. Luke puts a particular focus on mastering fighting without using anger or other dark side emotions. Rey points out that this is all well and good, but she needs to practice actually dueling and probably against somebody using dark side techniques. At this, Luke suggests they go down to the weird dark side place in the center of the island, where Rey might experience a simulation of a battle against a dark side opponent. Rey heads down and ends up fighting a dark side version of herself. She keeps this information secret from Luke though. Poe, Finn, Rose and DJ arrive at Canto Bight and decide to split up into two groups to track down the data that they would need to incriminate Holdo. Rose and Finn head off through the casino, and Finn is impressed by the glamour and luxury of the whole place. However, Rose is critical of the culture and makes the same objections about the cruelty to animals and exploitation of orphans as in the Disney film. After training one night, Rey has another discussion with Kylo. We begin to see their relationship develop further as they talk and connect. I'd also have this be Kylo's sexy shirtless scene, and given that Rey is now learning about the Force from a light side perspective, she could push at the idea that Kylo could come back to the light. To this, I would have Kylo respond by saying that he still feels that she hates him for killing Han, and she doesn't want to forgive him. She's holding back her hatred, and he says that she can't reach her full potential if she's holding back. She'll never achieve victory that way. And then, if it didn't come off as too corny, I'd be inclined to have Rey remark that she can at least achieve victory against her own hatred and avoid ending up like Kylo, who killed the person who loved him the most. Kylo would be slightly taken aback and moved by this objection. Poe and DJ are trying to get past a particular security guard for DJ to gain access to the schematics of the building. Fortunately, the security guard is female, so DJ suggests that Poe flirt with her as a distraction. I like the idea that Poe would be like, oh yeah, because I'm the good-looking one, and then DJ would seem really offended and be like, no, because I'm the one who's good at hacking. So Poe begins to flirt with her while DJ sneaks past and accesses the computer. Meanwhile, Rose and Finn continue exploring the casino and end up finding the stables for the horse race. Rose ends up convincing Finn to sabotage the operation because of its questionable moral practices. She would perhaps bring up the fact that Finn is a hero and heroes fight against evil. Poe and DJ head towards the elevator and DJ explains where they need to head to, but he'll have to hack the elevator in order to get to the proper floor. He says that they'll need a distraction in order for him to be able to do this, and Poe makes a look and is like, oh, so you want me to? And then DJ derisively cuts him off like, listen, Mr. Good-Looking, we don't have time for you to flirt with the entire casino. We'll just have to come up with another distraction. At this point, suddenly, a herd of rabbit horses stampede through the casino, and Poe and DJ both reckon that should do the trick. Rose and Finn ride out the exit of the casino and, in their effort to avoid the authorities, end up stealing a spaceship. Rey and Luke continue their training further, and we see that Rey has really advanced her Jedi skills substantially. We even see Luke beginning to seem quite happy with himself as a trainer. However, Rey takes the conversation in a more serious direction by asking if when it is time for her to leave the island, would Luke be willing to come with her. By the way, I would like to clarify something about the timeline at this point. You may be wondering how much training Rey actually gets in the film, and I'll just say that I imagine there being approximately a week-long gap between Poe and Finn leaving the Raddus and them arriving on Canto Bight. During this time, the Raddus continues to be pursued to Crate, and Rey makes significant progress with her training. Luke responds that he isn't sure if he can bring himself to leave the island. He could again repeat his anxieties about living with the inflated legend of being the hero of the rebellion and how hard it was to adjust to that. Pivoting slightly, Luke addresses another important issue. If he is going to return as the hero for the New Republic, will he have to confront Kylo? And if so, will he have to kill him? Luke says resolutely that he would not be able to do that. Rey points out that Luke didn't have to kill Vader. Vader chose to turn to the light side. She cites this as an example of how people can change for the better. Luke responds to this by saying, "They don't always though, and what do I do then?" We then cut to Kylo walking over to Snoke, who again reiterates the basic plan and says that everything is almost ready to spring the trap that will destroy the Republic. Kylo swears his allegiance to Snoke and heads off with Captain Phasma to a troop transport. Poe and DJ make it to a room where they store the files for previous purchases, and DJ brings up blueprints of 4 Star Destroyers that have Death Star technology built into them, capable of destroying entire planets. DJ points out to Poe that the First Order is still a relatively small insurgency force and certainly wouldn't be able to afford this level of destructive tech. He points out that there's only one military force in the galaxy that would be able to afford this type of technology, the Republic. He suggests that it would seem Poe is correct in his suspicions regarding Holdo redirecting resources to secure arms for the First Order. They get pursued by some security and have to be rescued by Finn and Rose, who show up in the ship they stole. Poe informs them of the Star Destroyer plans, and they collectively conclude that there is only one place where it would make sense to launch the destructive potential of these ships, the deep core of the galaxy, so they resolve to head there as soon as possible. Rey retires for the night and again Force connects with Kylo. Much like their conversation in the Disney version, Kylo confronts her about her need to have surrogate fathers in everybody, and then says that Luke isn't who she thinks he is. Kylo explains that when he was young, Luke tried to kill him. Okay. So, some people hate the fact that Luke considers killing Kylo in The Last Jedi, and I honestly have to say, I don't really get why. As I see it, Luke considering killing Kylo makes sense both from a character and story perspective. Firstly, getting tempted by the dark side is an incredibly common occurrence for Jedi. It's something that they have to deal with on a regular basis, and this is very established within the Star Wars canon. I don't see how Luke briefly, for a passing moment, considering doing something immoral would be anything other than entirely on brand for Jedi within the Star Wars canon. Secondly, Luke experienced firsthand all the horrors that came from Anakin's turn to the dark side. If we understand Luke's main character conflict being centered around the emotional toll emerging from his participation in the fight against the Galactic Empire, then it makes total sense that he would consider taking drastic action to prevent that happening again. I'm betting if you offered Luke the opportunity to go back in time and kill Padawan Anakin to prevent all the pain he experienced and witnessed in the original trilogy, he'd consider that for a moment too. Thirdly, it's implied that Luke considers killing Kylo because of a prophetic dream. This is already an established ability for Skywalkers. Anakin turned to the dark side because of his prophetic dreams of traumatic events, which he sought to prevent. In the case of his dream of Padme dying in childbirth, it almost seems as if it was a self-fulfilling prophecy, where his actions to save Padme are what actually led to her death. This is appropriately mirrored in Luke's actions after his premonition of Kylo turning to the dark side being what caused Kylo to turn to the dark side. However, this also helps to accentuate how Luke is different and more moral than his father. While Anakin was tempted to the dark side and then fell to it as a result of his prophetic dreams, Luke was tempted and then immediately regretted it. And this leads to the final point for why I think Luke being tempted to the dark side could work if it totally destroys Luke. In this regard, the Disney film kind of screws itself over. For example, it makes sense that Luke would reject the idea of even holding a lightsaber. In his darkest, most shameful moment, he held a lightsaber, when he considered killing an innocent boy. Of course, he'd not want to hold a lightsaber, but the Disney film ruins this by having him throwing it away as a humorous subversion. Similarly, when Luke meets Kylo, he should be tearfully apologizing for letting him down, not callously mocking him. The Disney film also detracts from this by having Luke talk about how the Jedi needs to end. Luke should be taking personal responsibility for his own mistakes, not passing the blame onto the institution of the Jedi more generally. This is why, in my version, Luke isn't saying the Jedi needs to end, rather he's saying that he, Luke Skywalker, the man, is not up to the task of being the hero everybody wants him to be, and is deathly afraid of what might happen if he accepts that role, and is then tempted to the dark side again. That's powerful stuff in my view. So yeah, in my version, Luke does get tempted by the dark side, but it is treated appropriately as far as tone and character are concerned. And with this said, Rey then confronts Luke about considering killing Kylo, and Luke admits to it, much like he did in the Disney film. He stresses that it was just a passing temptation, but also fully admits his guilt, and that the fact he even considered it has been tearing him apart. We then finally return to the Radis, and the troop transports begin to land on Crate while Leia and Holdo speak. They acknowledge the First Order will be launching their assault to come capture Leia soon, but Holdo insists that they have to trust that their plan will work. Rey explains that she was able to feel Kylo's thoughts, and she knows that he is about to confront Leia, so she decides to go confront him to save Leia and potentially turn him away from the dark side. Before she goes, she tells Luke that she saw a dark side version of herself in the cave, and that she feels the temptation of the dark side too. But you don't defeat evil by shutting yourself off from others, but by going out and trying to help the ones you love. She gets in the X-Wing she arrived in and speeds off. Poe and Finn arrive at the Deep Core to find that there is already a sizable Republic army present, which makes sense because 4 large Star Destroyers wouldn't go completely unnoticed. As soon as Poe shows up, he informs the Republic army that these Star Destroyers have Death Star tech and would be able to destroy a single planet with one shot if they get close enough. This changes the plan slightly and obligates the Republic army to meet the Star Destroyers further away from the Deep Core and also to infiltrate the ships as quickly as possible. The first portion of the battle begins with a series of dogfights to weaken the defenses of the Star Destroyers. To keep with the logic of them having to get onto the ship as fast as possible, I do like the idea of troops having to land on the surface of the ship to fight their way into it, but this would require some kind of explanation for how they can avoid dying due to the lack of breathable atmosphere. Weirdly, spacesuits don't seem to be a thing in the Star Wars universe, but hopefully it wouldn't be too jarring to have a group of soldiers land with spacesuits and start fighting their way to vulnerable parts of the ship where they can break in. Meanwhile, Rey has intercepted Kylo's ship and decides to board it to confront him. Much like in the Disney film, he responds by arresting Rey and reporting to Snoke that he has captured her. Snoke tells Kylo to bring Rey to him and leave Captain Phasma to complete the rest of the mission to capture Leia and the other Republic generals. Rey says that he doesn't have to do this, but Kylo insists that he has no choice. The battle at the Deep Core continues, with the Republic troops finally beginning to break their way into the Star Destroyers. Finn disables one of the Star Destroyer shields from the inside, which allows even more Republic troops to enter the Star Destroyers via ships, including Poe, who docks his speeder. It would probably be implied by the film, but might nonetheless need to be explicitly stated, that the tactical situation for this battle is that the Republic has the numerical advantage, but they're under pressure when it comes to time. Meanwhile, the First Order are simply trying to delay the Republic as much as possible. Therefore, the First Order troops engage in a lot of tactical retreating to stall the Republic forces, which in turn causes the Republic to dock even more troops to overwhelm the defenders and overrun the ships. Meanwhile, we see the First Order begin the attack on Crate. The Republic forces are nowhere near as small as they are in the Disney film, but it's still clear that the Republic won't be able to last long. Leia asks Holdo whether it's time to put her plan into action, but Holdo says it isn't the right time yet as the First Order is only sending the first wave, and they need to wait for the larger starships to arrive. Back at the Deep Core battle, Hux is captured by Republic troops who have seized the bridge of the starship. Shortly after this, Poe makes it to the center of the ship and discovers no Death Star technology. The area in the blueprints where the Death Star technology should be appears to contain an explosive device. Poe tries to make a call to other ships, but gets no response. He announces that it is a trap as he hears nothing but static over his communication device and begins to run away as fast as he can. However, he doesn't get far before the ship begins to explode. Poe turns around to face his own death when suddenly the explosion is halted. Luke Skywalker has shown up and is using the Force to contain the explosion. He tells Poe to escape and get all the troops off the starship as fast as possible. Poe races to get off the Star Destroyer. We see that the other Star Destroyers have exploded, killing many Republic troops. Poe contacts Finn to confirm that he is okay. He points out that this wasn't the main attack, it was merely a decoy. Finn then wonders aloud where the actual attack could be taking place, and they both realize it must be against Leia. Luke struggles to contain the explosion until he is sure that everybody has escaped from the ship. We see an expression of pure serenity on his face as he disappears and becomes one with the Force, just before the explosion encompasses the whole ship. Kylo and Rey arrive to meet with Snoke. Snoke asks if Kylo has heard any news about the attack on the Deep Core, and it seems as if Snoke is unaware that the attack was a ruse. Also, if I really wanted to make the timeline clear in relation to the time it would take to travel around the galaxy, then I would maybe have Snoke say that the attack was a few days ago. Either way, Kylo kills Snoke. I wouldn't have it be quite as drawn out as it is in the Disney version. Basically, as soon as Snoke reveals that he is unaware that the attack in the Deep Core was a feint, it should be obvious that he is no longer in charge of things, and we can therefore infer that he's about to be betrayed. Kylo clinically cutting Snoke down without much regard at all is simply confirming this. We see Rey interpret this as Kylo achieving some sort of redemption, and depending on the runtime of the film, we could maybe include Kylo and Rey fighting together against the Praetorian Guards, but if not, then there's already plenty of other action, so we could just have the Praetorian Guards be in on the conspiracy to kill Snoke too. I suppose I should justify killing Snoke, because apparently lots of people were upset that Snoke died without having a backstory. Now, in my view, Snoke could never be the real villain of this trilogy, and that's simply because he's too disconnected from the rest of the Star Wars saga. Obviously, it would be pretty rubbish to have your climactic villain for the saga be some dude who doesn't really have anything to do with the first 2/3 of it. So I understand that this is where the desire for Snoke to have a backstory comes from, but honestly, that to me would just feel like a sloppy retcon. You would be retroactively inserting Snoke into the events of George Lucas's saga in some desperate effort to insist that actually Snoke is important. There are 3 potential ways to do this, and I want to go through each option and explain why I think it doesn't work. The first option would be to insert Snoke as a new character in the Lucas saga. So all the time that the saga was going on, it turns out that actually Snoke was just there the whole time. This makes me think of the ridiculous Saw sequels where the go-to twist was to reveal that actually there was somebody else working with Jigsaw the whole time, and it became a joke to imagine that in all the previous films this person was just out of frame as Jigsaw was doing his thing. If I made a Saw parody, I'd have it so the twist is that every single character was working for Jigsaw. I'd have the camera showing Jigsaw setting up one of his traps, and then it would just pan to the right for a solid minute while we slowly reveal the entire cast just hanging out next to him. Know why that would work for a parody? Because it highlights how ridiculous this twist is. And yes, this would be the twist if it was revealed that Snoke was actually involved in the original saga. If you just pan to the right, Snoke stood right there, just doing his thing. If you want your films to be filled with sloppy retcons, then that's fine, but I don't. Now, the second option would be to have the reveal that Snoke is actually a minor protagonist from the original saga, because that's a twist. The main version of this twist I'm aware of is the idea that Mace Windu is actually Snoke. The problem with this is that Snoke doesn't act anything like Mace Windu. There are no minor protagonists from the original saga who are sufficiently well characterized to satisfyingly present as your main villain for the final installment. I don't want to see the entire saga culminate with an epic battle against Dexter Jettster. If the main point of having Snoke be somebody from the established canon is to satisfyingly relate his character to the established canon, then that's kind of pointless if you need to radically re-characterize somebody in order for them being Snoke to make sense. The third option would be to have Snoke be a secondary antagonist from the original saga. This at least makes some sense, as it doesn't require completely denaturing a character from the other films. Now, I could explain why it would be pretty dumb for Maul or Dooku or Grievous to be Snoke, but I want to again just focus on the main name I've heard thrown around, Darth Plagueis. Some people think it would have been super epic if Snoke was actually Plagueis, but it really wouldn't have. Plagueis is only mentioned in one solitary line in the prequel trilogy. Is that really enough basis for him to be the final antagonist of the saga? Also, if Plagueis is alive, then that ruins Palpatine's character. One of the ways we can recognize Palpatine as both evil and powerful is that he bested and killed his own master. If he actually failed to kill Plagueis, then that retroactively makes him look kind of impotent. That smirk he gives when telling the story of Plagueis no longer speaks to Palpatine's abilities as a cold, calculating killer, but rather his misplaced confidence. And of course, thematically, it would just be terrible. When Palpatine mentions Plagueis being able to live forever with the Force, it's pretty obvious that he's tempting Anakin with something he can never really have. If Plagueis actually was able to preserve his life and live forever, then I guess that just makes Palpatine into a really incompetent or lazy teacher. The one and only scene where Plagueis is mentioned in the Lucas saga just works so much better if Plagueis is actually dead. So there we go. If there's no intelligent way to relate Snoke to the rest of the saga, and it would be stupid to have the final antagonist of the whole saga be somebody unrelated to the rest of it, then I have absolutely no problem with saying bye-bye Snoke. And no, at least in my case, it's not about subverting expectations. It's about getting rid of a character who has served his purpose for the story. Captain Phasma finally arrives to launch the invasion of Crate after the first wave a few days ago was unsuccessful in breaking through. Holdo says it's now time to launch the plan, and the Republic forces start to fly up on smaller ships in the direction of the Radis, which has been floating in orbit idly. However, suddenly Poe arrives and accuses Holdo of betraying the Republic, Everybody is a bit confused by this, and Poe explains that Holdo has been ordering ships from Canto Bight, which makes weapons for the First Order. Holdo responds to this by saying that Canto Bight makes weapons for all sides. Even Poe's ship was made on Canto Bight. Holdo placed the order for the ships they're flying right now that they're making their escape in. Poe is a little thrown by this information, but continues on by pointing out that Holdo hid some important intel when Poe walked in and acted suspicious about it. Poe asks her what the information was, and Holdo says she has no idea what he's talking about. Poe says that he actually saw where she filed it and tells Finn to bring up the information on the computer. At this, Holdo attempts to stop them looking at the information by saying that it's just details of an old military operation that didn't go particularly well and she was embarrassed about it. But Poe tells Finn to bring up the information. Suddenly, Finn stops and stares at the screen in disbelief. Poe surmises that some incriminating information has been uncovered and somewhat triumphantly asks Finn to reveal it. However, Finn says nothing, prompting Poe to address Finn again with slight trepidation. Holdo looks down in resigned sadness as Finn looks at Poe. Finn says in a quivering, broken voice, "The ship you blew up on your first assignment, it wasn't just smuggling weapons. You killed them. You killed my family." At this, Poe can hardly say anything. He looks at Holdo, realizing why she had been protective of this information. Holdo looks at Poe with sorrow before saying that she needs to go. Leia asks Holdo if she's sure she wants to do this, but Holdo says that she needs to be the one to do it because it's her plan. The ship docks next to the Radis and she gets off. Poe attempts to apologize to Finn, but Finn is unable to bring himself to say anything. He walks over to the transport they arrived in and prepares to fly off. Okay, so this is an entirely new addition to the plot from me, but I could maybe see it being controversial, so I'll give it a quick explanation. The main reason I included it was to function as a logical red herring for why Holdo would be acting suspicious, but it also really helps this film function as a second act. Finn and Poe now have a rift in their friendship, which will need to be resolved in the next film. It also works a little bit with Poe's character arc by driving home the fact that his heroics have unintended consequences. The main objection I could see people making is how this information is revealed. Would they really file the names of every individual casualty in an operation? Would Holdo recognize the names as belonging to Finn's family? And to that I say, yes, they would. It's like a police report. After the mission is over, there would be people who investigate the mission and its effects, and that information would be filed. Is it a coincidence that the information happened to be filed alongside the incredibly plot-significant R2? A little bit, yeah. On that note, people might wonder how R2 ended up being filed away in some old Jedi archive, and my honest opinion is that this question would be best answered in some supplementary material, like a comic book. Finally, is it a coincidence that Poe and Finn happen to be friends and they happen to also be connected in this very specific way? Yes it is. It's a massive, impossibly unbelievable coincidence. But, I mean, this is Star Wars. I think there's a precedent for having these kinds of ridiculous coincidences every now and then. Anyway, back to the film. Kylo and Rey are still standing in the aftermath of Snoke's murder. They have a conversation much like in the Disney film, where Kylo asks her to stop holding on to the past and join him in forging the new future. To prove his point that she should let go of the past, he reveals the truth about Rey's parents. They were filthy junk traders who sold her for drinking money. Okay, so we're going to have to break from the rewrite again to discuss Rey's parentage. What would be the best reveal for who Rey's parents are? Well, as I see it, any answer would need to make sense from a plot perspective, as well as mattering for Rey's character. On the latter point, it's worth establishing what the mystery of Rey's parents means for her character. Rey clearly believes that her parents must have abandoned her for a reason, and that they're coming back. The logical inference here is that Rey believes the universe is basically a good place where if a child is abandoned, it must have been done for a good reason, and be something that will be rectified at a later point. Any answer to who Rey's parents are would have to mean something as far as this character trait is concerned. Now, most answers wouldn't mean much at all. If Rey is a Kenobi or a Mothma or an Akbar, so what? Rey wanting to know who her parents are isn't just about wanting a surname. It's about wanting some resolution to what she endured as a child. As I see it, there are three potential answers that would make Rey's parentage potentially interesting. The first is that Rey descends from one of the film's antagonists, so for example, that Rey is a Snoke. Now this can be dismissed out of hand because it would simply be rehashing the reveal from Empire Strikes Back. Having the main Jedi hero be the child of a villainous character has already been done once. It also worked much better for Luke's specific priorities as a character in a way it wouldn't as much for Rey. Now, the second option is that Rey is a solo. The reason this would work from a character perspective is that Rey wanted to know her parents, so it would be tragic for her to discover that she did know one of her parents, but he was taken away from her by Kylo. It also would add an extra dimension to her hatred of Kylo. However, this wouldn't make sense logically. If Han is her dad, why did he abandon her? Are we to believe that Han was a serial adulterer while he was married to Leia? Wow, that would be a surefire way to ruin his character. The reality is that there is no way to have Han be Rey's dad and have it make sense. Oh, and of course, if we're generally trying to avoid unbelievable coincidences, then having Rey be a relative of Han Solo would add a massive coincidence to the plot. Now, the third option is that Rey's parents were bad people. Logically, this works perfectly. If Rey's parents were bad people, then we don't need to twist logic at all to answer why Rey ends up abandoned on Jakku. There's also no coincidence to her being involved in the plot at all either. And as for the emotional resonance for Rey, I mean, goodness me, how long have you got? This totally turns Rey's entire view of the world on its head. Up until this point, she has been convinced that her parents must have had a reason for what they did and that everything would work out eventually. And now she's been forced to confront the fact that actually no, this thing that caused her formative years to be filled with hardship and misery has no more of an explanation than just sometimes people are just horrible and awful, even to their own children. Also, with this option, Han's death is still impactful, because regardless of him not being her actual father, he was still the closest thing she had to a loving father, so it still makes total sense that she would hate Kylo for killing Han. Indeed, it would make even more sense. Kylo had a father who loved him, but rejected that. Meanwhile, Rey finds out that her parents didn't love her at all. How much more angry would that make her with Kylo, who took the love of his parents for granted? There's a lot to work with there. I'm aware that there are people who don't like the reveal that Rey's parents were filthy junk traders who sold her for drinking money, and I don't know why, because I think it could have been a really clever way to advance her character. There are two reasons why I could imagine somebody disliking the reveal about Rey's parentage. The first one is that the film as a whole just isn't very good in terms of plotting and tone, so when this happens it feels like less of a well-delivered emotional gut punch and more of just Rian Johnson annoyingly subverting expectations. The second reason would be that actually people responded to the reveal as intended and did experience it as this really depressing piece of information, but they didn't like those feelings, and therefore decided that it was just a bad reveal. As far as I'm concerned though, that is what makes it such a good reveal. I do, however, think the impact of the reveal isn't handled very well. You've probably noticed that basically this entire rewrite has been me giving credit to Rian Johnson's ideas, but criticizing the execution, and this is no exception. As I already said, this reveal that Rey's parents are nobody should completely destroy her. I mean, it should turn her into an emotional wreck. Imagine if you were forced to confront the reality that what you had been putting all your hope in for literally your entire life was in fact pure self-delusion. I can't even imagine how I would react to that revelation. However, according to the Disney film, the way Rey reacts to this is she's pretty chirpy just a few minutes later. She shows up in the Millennium Falcon and is whooping and smiling. She has this epic, awesome Jedi moment. I genuinely believe that the Luke Vader reveal in Episode 5 was less devastating than the reveal of Rey's parents in Episode 8. After all, Luke already had a family who loved him. Luke's life was seemingly pretty happy for the first 2 decades. It's not like in Rey's case where her only hope through an early life of complete misery was relating to her parents. And yet, the Luke Vader reveal feels way more interesting because of how much Luke reacts to it. It's an incredibly dramatic moment that really makes you feel how much this revelation hurts Luke. That's what sells it, and that's what's missing from Rey's reaction. In my version, this is the last time we see Rey. She doesn't show up later to smile and cheer and stand around for the final shot of the group all together. Nope, she falls to her knees, cries uncontrollably, and then looks to Kylo with complete defeat in her eyes as he offers his hand to her and asks her to join him. And that's Rey's final scene of the film, totally destroyed by the revelation that everything she had been hoping for is never going to happen. Meanwhile, the smaller ships escaping Krayt all begin to head off in different directions, so that Phasma can't know which ones have the key generals in them. Phasma directs the largest ship to fire on the escaping fleet. However, at this point, Holdo goes into hyperspace and does the lightspeed ram. Now this is the moment I'm most proud of, because I wasn't planning on including the lightspeed ram in this rewrite. After all, there are some obvious problems with it. Firstly, like I already said, hyperspace isn't just going really fast, it's entering a different physical plane, so you can't just hit a stationary object at hyperspace speeds. Secondly, of course, if this strategy works, why hasn't anybody ever tried it before? And thirdly, even if this is the first time somebody has come up with this plan, why wouldn't everybody use it going forward? And on this last question, the Rise of Skywalker comes up with the most hilarious retcon ever in the form of that moves 1 in a million, meaning that Holdo was presumably trying to hyperspace away, but just got really unlucky. However, you may have noticed that I made a specific point of saying that the hyperdrive was broken in such a way that it was basically blurring the boundary between hyperspace and regular space. This slight change solves all 3 of the problems with the lightspeed ram. Firstly, it solves the problem that hyperspace is a different physical plane because the boundaries between the physical planes are being blurred, so we can imagine that it is at this very specific moment possible to travel at hyperspace speeds within normal space. It solves the second problem because it was already stressed that the hyperdrive was only able to do this due to being accidentally damaged. So we don't need to ask why nobody ever came up with this strategy before, because nobody would have even thought this was possible before. And as for whether this could be a new strategy going forward, it has again been stressed that the way the hyperdrive was damaged was perplexing to the Republic engineers, so we can infer that it might be impossible going forward for them to work out exactly how this was done. So once I realized that it would be possible to include the lightspeed ram without destroying the logic of the Star Wars universe, I figured why not include it? And it works really well because it actually makes Holdo come across as a really competent commander. We can assume that once she realized how the hyperdrive was damaged, she was the one who worked out the potential military applications of this, and she set this trap to destroy this major First Order ship and prevent them capturing the Republic generals. Also, while her not telling Poe the plan doesn't play as big of a role in my version as it does in the Disney version, it makes way more sense here for Holdo to not tell Poe the plan, since we were told repeatedly that there was a spy on the Raddus. So of course, Holdo would have kept this plan perfectly secret, and the plan would only really work if everybody obeyed orders and just trusted that the commander knew what they were doing, which of course is the whole point of Poe's character arc for this film. He realizes that he's totally misjudged Holdo and actually did a lot more damage to the Republic by going off on his own and falling hook, line and sinker for the ruse about the Death Star technology on the starships. And unlike in the Disney film, where Poe's plan ends up failing due to Finn and Rose being stupid, here it fails because of his decisions and his judgment about Holdo, preventing him considering other options before going rogue. Hux is taken in chains to the Republic capital, where he is greeted by Lor San Tekka, who I'm going to be using the image of General Pride for now, because I wanted to introduce Lor San Tekka in my rewrite of The Force Awakens, but didn't want to give away immediately that I was planning on having him turn evil. Oh, I haven't mentioned he's evil yet. So San Tekka shockingly has his personal bodyguards kill the guards arresting Hux, and it's revealed that First Order sympathizers have taken over the Deep Core. As the Republic forces are escaping Krayt, Leia converses with Luke. Much like the Disney film, we hear that Leia believes her son is gone, and Luke tells her that no one is really gone. I would like to make one addition to this conversation though. Leia remarks to Luke that she wishes he could be there to help her with the enemy who is emerging. Luke says that he has known for a while that Palpatine will return, as he had a vision of Kylo turning to the dark side, and he now realizes this vision was sent by Palpatine. However, he assures Leia that they will be able to defeat him when he comes back, because Luke will not be the Last Jedi. We end the film with DJ landing a ship on Exegol. He arrives at a swirling mass of darkness and says that he has been a faithful servant. The time is almost right for Palpatine to return. So I already said that you can't finish this saga by having a villain who has nothing to do with the rest of the saga, and maybe at that point you suspected I was heading in this direction. As far as I'm concerned, Palpatine is the only villain who can work for this final installment, because he was the main villain of the prequel trilogy and the main villain of the original trilogy. it doesn't really make sense for him to not play a big part in the sequel trilogy. Now, some might say that this undoes episode 6 and undercuts that finale, and I agree it does to some extent, which is why my position has always been that the sequel trilogy shouldn't have been made in the first place. However, I don't think bringing Palpatine back is necessarily a bad decision, depending on how it's handled. And to evidence this, I would like to point to the two other intellectual properties that rival Star Wars in terms of popularity: The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. These films both feature a previously defeated villain trying to return back to full power, and in some sense, wouldn't it have been almost more epic if we started off seeing Sauron or Voldemort in their prime, saw an entire film series about that, and then later on had this big reveal that these villains are still out there and waiting to return? The key point is that there needs to be a sense in which these powerful characters have been considerably nerfed. Both Sauron and Voldemort don't have physical bodies when we see them, and the same would be true for Palpatine. Anakin defeating Palpatine is no less of a victory than Isildur defeating Sauron or Lily Potter defeating Voldemort with her love. The victory matters and still saves the day, it just needs to be finalized by putting the nails in the coffin to prevent those evil forces from returning. I was actually so enthused by the idea of Palpatine being out there and trying to come back that I almost considered making that the main focus of each individual plot. However, my main goal with these first two rewrites has been to heavily use the original films as a blueprint, which has meant avoiding radical changes to the direction of the plot. Therefore, all we have here is the reveal that Palpatine is out there in some form, and he is planning on returning. This return will be the main focus of Episode 9. I'm not sure how this rewrite will be received. On the one hand, a lot of people disliked The Last Jedi, so maybe they'd like a rewrite. On the other hand, I've actively tried to make my film closely follow the Disney film. I did this because the purpose of these rewrites is to show how a few minor changes can dramatically improve a film, in my opinion. I would appreciate people's feedback. Please do comment below to let me know what you think is better about this rewrite, but also where you think it could be improved. If you like this video, then please do actually hit the like button. Also, subscribe if you would like to see where this rewrite eventually ends, as well as other projects I'm planning on doing in the future. I would actually like to take this whole YouTube film review thing quite seriously, and that would be helped a lot by you guys helping with the algorithm stuff and maybe sharing this video around. Thank you for watching, and I hope you'll stick around for episode 9.